Dispatch, this is Unit 4. Conditions are worsening rapidly.
Copy 4. ETA unchanged. Proceed with caution.
I'm seeing something up ahead in the fog. Need backup.
Look, I never thought I'd be here, sharing this with thousands of people on the internet. When you wear a police uniform, you're trained to believe in logic, physical evidence, fingerprints, and human motives. You learn to look at the darker side of society and find a rational explanation for evil. I moved from Denver to a tiny town nestled in the Colorado mountains, seeking the exact opposite of urban chaos. I wanted a peaceful routine, the occasional traffic ticket, rescuing cats from trees, and dealing with bar fights. The town had fewer than 2,000 inhabitants, surrounded by dense pine forests that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. It was the kind of place where the radio signal died as soon as you crossed the welcome sign, and where winter transformed the landscape into a white, isolated wasteland. I was the rookie, the outsider who needed to prove his worth to Sheriff Miller, a man who had ruled that place with an iron fist for over 20 years. But what I didn't know, what nobody tells you at the police academy, is that there are places in the world where the law of men is just a facade to protect things that should only exist in nightmares. This is a true horror story. It's not an urban legend, it's not a campfire tale. I saw what it is. I saw the monster the city protects, and the worst part of my daily torment is knowing that it's still there, breathing, hunting, while I had to throw my badge in the trash and flee in the middle of the night to avoid becoming the next victim of a system that covers up the inexplicable. Paranoia has taken over my life, and every shadow now sends chills down my spine. It all began in late October, when the cold was already dropping temperatures and snow was starting to accumulate on the back roads. I was on the night shift, driving the patrol car along Route 9, a dirt road that snaked up the mountain about 15 miles from the city center. It was a pitch-black night. The darkness seemed to swallow the light of the headlights, and the surrounding forest was an impenetrable wall of dark trunks. My radio crackled, breaking the deathly silence of the patrol car with a call from the dispatcher. A local farmer had reported that his nephew, a strong young man in his early 20s who worked repairing fences, hadn't returned home after nightfall. The normal protocol for a place like that was to wait until morning, assuming the boy had gotten stuck in the snow or drunk too much in some cabin. But something in the farmer's voice was laden with visceral panic. He said the horses in the stable were completely mad, breaking the stalls in sheer terror. I noted the coordinates and turned the car around, driving for another good 8 miles along a road that was little more than a logging trail. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming. There were no streetlights, no other houses, just the swaying of the car on the rocks and the growing sense that I was trespassing on territory that didn't belong to humans. I had no idea I was driving straight into the scene that would inaugurate the most grotesque chapter of my life. When I arrived at the indicated location, I found the boy's pickup truck blocking the dirt road, its headlights still on, illuminating the emptiness of the forest, and the driver's side door wide open. I got out of the vehicle, my hand resting on my holster, feeling the icy wind cut my face. The first thing I noticed was the total absence of sound in the forest. The nocturnal animals were completely silent, as if nature itself were holding its breath. As I approached the truck, the beam of my flashlight revealed the physical horror. There was a lot of blood on the steering wheel and dashboard, splattered violently, not like an accidental cut, but like an artery exploding. The vehicle's door wasn't just open, it was twisted outwards, its thick metal hinges bent as if made of aluminum foil. No human, no matter how strong or under the influence of any drug, would have the strength to do that. I swallowed hard and began to scan the ground around the vehicle with the light. That's when I found the marks. There was a trail of blood and churned up earth stretching into the dark forest, indicating that the boy had been dragged. But these weren't boot prints or bear tracks. What I saw etched into the hard snow were incredibly deep footprints, with strides measuring about 7 feet apart. It wasn't running on 4 legs. It walked on 2 legs. It was bipedal, and by the impact imprinted on the ground, the creature easily weighed over 400 pounds. Terror began to settle in my stomach. I was alone, miles from any reinforcements, facing evidence of werewolf encounters that I had always considered pure fiction. I called for backup on the radio, my voice trembling more than I cared to admit. Almost 40 minutes later, the flashing lights of Sheriff Miller's car ripped through the darkness. He got out of the car, but he wasn't alone. His son, David, was in the passenger seat and got out soon after. David was a guy who always gave me the creeps. He was almost 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and had a physical presence that seemed to fill all the space around him. He never spoke much, just stayed in the back of the station, observing everything with dark, opaque eyes. The townspeople treated him with a mixture of deference and veiled fear, and the sheriff acted as if his son were untouchable, protecting him from any more direct interaction with outsiders. Miller walked to the crime scene, looked at the twisted door, at the blood, and then at the impossible footprints leading into the woods. I expected him to declare an immediate tactical search, to call in sniffer dogs or the state police. Instead, he kicked some snow over the clearest claw mark, obscuring the main evidence, and turned to me with a cold expression. He stated categorically that it had been a bear attack, that grizzly bears came down from the mountains hungry and could easily destroy a car door if they smelled food. I tried to argue, pointing to the distance between the footprints and the fact that a bear wouldn't walk bipedally, carrying a human body for more than 300 feet without supporting itself on its front paws. The sheriff just took a step toward me, invading my personal space, while David watched from the darkness, leaning against the patrol car with a smirk that made me feel like cornered prey. Miller ordered me to file the case exactly as he had dictated, and that the city didn't need to panic because of the fertile imagination of a big city cop. I was left behind with orders to wait for the tow truck and secure the area while the sheriff and his son returned to town to notify the family. Being alone on that road, after realizing the utter corruption of my superior authority, was the moment the true psychological horror began. I sat on the hood of the patrol car, trying to organize my thoughts and understand the moral conflict that had just been thrown into my lap. The law was protecting the truth. I picked up the flashlight once more and walked to the edge of the trees, where the trail faded into the deep darkness. I swept the light between the thick, damp trunks. About 60 feet away from me, the light didn't reflect off wood or snow. It reflected off 2 almond-shaped gleaming eyes, positioned at least 7 feet off the ground. My breath caught in my throat. The silhouette was massive, broad shoulders blocking the view of the trees behind him. It was him, the werewolf, the monster that was tearing the people of that town apart. He made no move, just stood there, perfectly still, observing me with a brutal, predatory intelligence that no ordinary animal possesses. His posture, the way he tilted his head almost mockingly, struck me with a nauseating familiarity. That immense profile, that heavy posture in the darkness. The human mind tries to deny it, tries to seek sanity, but instinct doesn't lie. There, Frozen in the Colorado cold, I knew with absolute certainty that what I was seeing wasn't just a forest legend. It was something integrated into our own system. Terror paralyzed me, and as the creature slowly retreated into the shadows without taking its eyes off me, I realized that my hunt wouldn't be for an animal, but against the very city I had sworn to protect. The Pine Ridge police station was a dark, old brick building, a box isolated from the outside world, suffocating and always smelling of burnt coffee, mold on the walls, and cheap industrial disinfectant. When I returned from my shift that fateful night, the silence inside was dense, heavy, almost palpable like a smokescreen. The old fluorescent light flickered annoyingly on the stained plaster ceiling, but I couldn't even pay attention to it. My mind was still trapped in the forest, held captive by the glint of those wild eyes, exactly 60 feet away from me in the darkness. I sat at my dented metal desk, the electric heater humming softly near my boots, dirty with snow and mud mixed with blood, and stared at the computer screen. Sheriff Miller had already filled out the preliminary case report. Wild animal attack provoked by victim's recklessness. Man presumably dragged by a large grizzly bear seeking food in winter. Reading those bureaucratic and deceitful words caused an uncomfortable knot in my stomach, a nausea generated by corruption. I knew what I had seen with my own eyes. I knew that the truck's door had been ripped off with an enormous torque that no normal animal could apply to reinforced steel hinges, and the footprints embedded in the hard, icy ground were almost 7 feet apart. That's basic predator anatomy. A quadruped doesn't walk upright like that, doesn't drag a grown man weighing over 200 pounds on 2 legs for dozens of yards into the woods without leaving any marks of its own weight or front paws on the ground. I started to sweat cold inside my thermal uniform. The heat from the heater seemed to suffocate me. I was the only rookie policeman in an archaic department of 5 men. All the other officers were born and raised in those harsh and cruel mountains. If I raised my voice there, pointed a finger, and said we were dealing with a strictly bipedal monster, a real werewolf, I would immediately be labeled crazy, or worse, I would become a thorn in the sheriff's side. The psychological and torturous fear began to take deep root in my sanity. The entire town of Pine Ridge seemed like a colossal, rotting, living organism, designed solely to protect a sick secret from outsiders. The absurd geographical isolation greatly helped maintain this facade. We were over 80 miles of dangerous highway from the nearest big city. The roads at the peak of winter were frequently blocked by avalanches or dark ice. It was the perfect, flawless setting for a bloody hunt with no outside witnesses. And what terrified me most in my gut was not just the biological existence of an impossible creature, but the cold, bureaucratic, methodical and calculating way in which a true human massacre was treated as routine by the local authorities. I felt tiny, surrounded by an ocean of dead trees and a chilling institutional silence that would ensure the boy was just another number filed away in oblivion. The next morning, after managing to close my eyes for only 2 hours of agonizing sleep, disturbed by vivid nightmares of piercing claws and crimson-stained teeth, I decided to go to the town's old diner, the only establishment that served a decent breakfast, and which had historically functioned as the true, unseen center of intelligence in Pine Ridge. The place reeked of bacon fried in old oil, motor grease carried in customers' boots, and cheap tobacco burning near the front door. I sat at the worn Formica counter and ordered a simple black coffee. As the waitress, her face tired and marked by premature wrinkles, filled my thick porcelain mug, I carefully observed the residents scattered around the tables through the thick cloud of hot steam and condensed breath on the windows. There were burly lumberjacks, grease-stained mechanics, owners of small winter supply stores. At first glance, they all seemed perfectly normal and integrated, but there was a heavy, static tension in the air, a silent electricity. No one there spoke a single word about the disappearance of the farmer's nephew on Route 9, and that was, without a doubt, the most unnatural and sickening thing in a small town. In any normal place in the country, such macabre gossip would spread like wildfire within minutes of sunrise. Here, the general silence was deafening and meticulously rehearsed. A group of 4 older men conversed in almost inaudible whispers in the dark back of the hall, and when one of them raised his head, his gaze meeting my police uniform, he quickly and with evident nervousness turned his entire face back to his plate of scrambled eggs. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. They knew. It was precisely then that my growing paranoia reached an unexplored and terrifying level. I began to meticulously notice every furtive glance cast in my direction, the abrupt way in which routine conversations literally died and froze the moment the sheriff or I crossed the threshold of any building in that damned town. It was an entire community held psychologically hostage by an insurmountable ancestral fear, but also bound by a loyalty to a silent and morbid code of self-preservation. The suffocating environmental horror was ingrained in every minute detail. The merciless and relentless Colorado winter quickly covered everything with a white, icy, indifferent blanket, hiding the spilled blood and shredded evidence under 3 feet of freshly fallen snow. I physically felt that every dark tree in the majestic mountains surrounding us had hungry, angry eyes watching me. In a desperate attempt to extract something, I tried to strike up a casual conversation with the old gas station owner next to me about the increasing attacks of dangerous bears descending on the region. The gray-haired man, who had been lazily wiping the counter with a filthy rag, simply stopped moving. He gripped the wet cloth so tightly and panicked that his knuckles instantly turned white. His voice choked, low and visibly trembling. He warned me that some forgotten things up there in the deep mountains don't just crave fresh animal flesh, but that they take immense pleasure in the hunger for pure human fear. He finished the sentence, turned his back rigidly, and refused to utter another syllable. The tacit message was successfully delivered. If I continued snooping and asking questions aloud, I might be the next one to be torn apart in the darkness. The overwhelming feeling of being completely alone, without backup, and completely surrounded by veiled and terrified accomplices was a claustrophobia of the soul. The cold anatomy of an institutionalized lie is both fascinating and profoundly terrifying to investigate clandestinely when you are theoretically part of the established justice system. During my long, monotonous afternoon shift, as the sun began to set prematurely behind the rocky peaks, I decided to secretly go to the isolated vehicle impound lot in the dark back of the police station. It was the exact spot where the missing boy's wrecked pickup truck had been towed away the previous night. The biting wind blew mercilessly through the valley, carrying that characteristic metallic smell of dry ice mixed with the sap of ancient pine trees. As I slowly unlocked the heavy padlock on the rusty barbed wire gate, the vehicle in question was carelessly covered by a blue plastic tarp, already partially frozen. I pulled the stiff fabric away with both hands and stared once more at the fatally destroyed metal. Illuminated by the weak natural light of the grey day, the structural damage was even more gruesome and incomprehensible to physical logic. The immense driver's side door, crafted from the heavy, sturdy steel of a rural pickup truck, wasn't just dented from a high-speed impact, it was literally ripped and bent inside out. Horrifying, deep marks tore through the gleaming metal, exactly 4 thick, perfectly parallel grooves that penetrated the steel's density as if it were nothing more than paper or melted wax. Carefully drawing the standard measuring tape I always carried on my tactical utility belt, I began measuring this physical horror. I observed in astonishment that the enormous grooves were almost a full inch deep, carved into the solid steel, and were ostentatiously spaced almost 3 full inches apart. No documented grizzly bear claw in this world possesses such anatomical reach, or even such gigantic bone density, capable of tearing through an automotive door with such extreme ease. However, the worst evidence wasn't just focused on the exterior of the violated door, but brutally concentrated on the interior panel itself. There was clear evidence of an absurd impact force that completely crushed the steering column, suggesting beyond a shadow of a doubt that the victim had been violently pinched and ripped from the seat against their will. Inspecting meticulously with the small service flashlight, I found hidden there some long strands of animal hair, macabrely entangled in the twisted metal support of the broken seatbelt. They were very thick, extremely rough to the touch, almost like flexible barbs of industrial wire, possessing a sinister dark grayish color completely incompatible with the brownish fur of local bears. Using nitrile gloves, I carefully placed the mysterious strands inside a tiny plastic evidence bag, quickly hiding it in the false bottom of my jacket pocket. I knew intrinsically that if I made the fatal mistake of filing and handing over this exotic material to Sheriff Miller, the bag would mysteriously disappear from the records before dawn. I had become, ironically, a completely clandestine investigator, operating covertly within my own municipal police department. Each new piece of physical evidence I found alone only further solidified my theory, which bordered on pure insanity. The werewolf was an undeniably real monster, a male specimen of massive proportions and an extremely sadistic and violent nature. It was clear that it possessed a highly developed predatory intelligence that allowed it to cruelly choose and select its prey based on criteria of vulnerability and nocturnal isolation. And the grotesque fact that the entire official and formal investigation of the event had been summarily closed, masked, and filed away before even beginning to collect concrete facts was the immutable and final proof that the city's administrative corruption and supernatural terror walked hand in hand, bloodied and intertwined, throughout that infernal city nestled in the icy mountains. The rhythmic progression of atmospheric tension became truly unbearable and suffocating during the long week following the macabre events on the dirt road. To maintain the appearance of normalcy and civic protocol, the cowardly residents ended up organizing a large, symbolic daytime search of the surrounding area, but I clearly noticed that none of them dared to venture even very deep into the dense, dark pine forest. They walked timidly only a few thousand feet into the safe and visible line of the marginal trees. The group walked extremely tightly together, shoulder to shoulder, heavily armed to the teeth, with expensive, high-powered hunting rifles, repeating shotguns, and heavy revolvers. but the expressions and cold sweat on their terrified faces unequivocally demonstrated that none of them were focused on hunting or rescuing anything. They were fervently praying to the heavens not to accidentally encounter the horror that everyone intimately knew lay in the dark heart of those ancient timbers. During the unfolding of the supposed rescue operation, I was summarily assigned to patrol the isolated and depopulated western edge of the city, specifically near the most abandoned and isolated rural properties off the main highway. The thick snow continued to fall relentlessly and heavily on the windshield, quickly erasing any traces left by the vehicles, but the brutal laws of nature never forgive and never hide everything for long. As I drove the weary service vehicle at a reduced 20 miles per hour along a potholed parallel road of rough gravel, I felt an absolutely putrid and nauseating smell forcefully invade the car's precarious ventilation system. It was the heavy and unmistakable smell of the end of life, an extremely dense and nauseating mixture of blackened blood with the odor of rusty copper and much exposed flesh rapidly decomposing in the cold air. All of this was bizarrely mixed with a very strong, musky and terribly damp odor, very similar to the characteristic smell of a wet and dirty wild dog, only multiplied exponentially until it burned deeply in human nostrils. I abruptly parked the vehicle on the sloping shoulder, firmly grabbed my assault rifle from its armored dashboard mount, and advanced with extreme and exaggerated caution through the accumulated snow that already reached my trembling knees. Walking slowly about 200 feet into the gloomy woods, I finally found the grotesque source of that deadly smell. It was a majestic specimen of an adult elk, or at least the meager and pathetic remains of what was once a great animal. The formidable and muscular elk, which surely weighed something in the impressive range of 800 pounds in life, had been brutally and inexplicably torn apart. Its enormous, sturdy spine had been literally split in two and bent with terrifying force, while the gigantic ribcage was wide open and methodically emptied of all vital organs in an almost surgical manner, yet with touches of supreme savagery. Around and very close to the magnificent ruined carcass, there they were again, impressing the soft, icy ground, those deep and crushing, strictly bipedal footprints. It left something very sinister and transparent. That immeasurable monster was no longer hunting for simple reasons of food survival in the harsh winter. It was carrying out monumental slaughter purely for the pleasure of sporting carnage and absolute territorial domination. The grotesque footprints purposefully circled the poor carcass several times, graphically demonstrating on the marked ground that the killer had sadistically played at cornering the large prey in desperation before delivering the final lethal blow. The colossal size of the footprint embedded in the ice was something that will continue to haunt me until the day I breathe my last. It measured an astonishing 15 inches in length. Amateurishly calculating by the massive depth of the weight sunk into the compact, resistant snow, that enormous creature easily weighed over an incredible 500 pounds of pure, agile muscle. To stand there, isolated, paralyzed in the exact middle of that damned, cursed forest, forcibly inhaling that infernal odor of open carnage, clutching tightly against my trembling shoulder an automatic rifle that I intimately knew to be utterly useless against something of that legendary size, was certainly one of those brief moments of terrifying clarity in which blind, visceral and purely animal panic took undeniable and absolute control over every single faculty of reasoning in my human mind. The verdict laid out in the snow was cruel and irrevocable, That mutant being was the untouchable and absolute alpha predator of the invisible food chain, and the entire populous city that lay in the valley below was nothing more than its mere and complacent private corral. The agonizing and dizzying escalation of all the environmental, psychological, and physical fear finally reached its ultimate boiling point in a completely secluded and unassuming moment, the instant I set out to solitarily piece together the small, distorted fragments of this large and morbid puzzle, leaning over the heavy boxes of old, dusty paper files negligently kept in the dark basements of the Pine Ridge police station. By an unfortunate twist of fate, it was my well-deserved official day off from duty, but I had previously learned that the frightening and complicit Sheriff Miller was conveniently out of town due to a supposed and unavoidable quarterly meeting of the county's High Public Safety Council, and David, his frighteningly silent son with perpetually clouded features, had also not been noticed or seen wandering like a vigilant ghost through the city's commercial outskirts during the last 2 fateful days. Faced with this unique window of opportunity, the old municipal government building was gracefully empty and immersed in a sepulchral and beneficial silence, isolated from the outside wind. I discreetly entered the old, cold room for cataloging and inactive files, a tiny, stuffy, dark, and frighteningly poorly ventilated room in the most neglected back of the structure. Settling at the rickety table under the yellowish light, I began the exhausting task of methodically pulling out and leafing through all the stained folders of heavy criminal occurrences irresponsibly filed away over the last disturbing decade. As I made handwritten notes, cross-referencing seemingly isolated facts, the immutable and somber narrative pattern emerged on the paper and became terrifyingly clear, obvious, and crystalline like the harshest light of day. Invariably, every blessed year in that locality, repeating itself precisely during the harshest, continuous winter months, notably between the intense winds of November and the rigorous dark nights of February, there was a methodical record of a sharp increase and a bloody peak involving strange and violent mass rural disappearances. Such sinister events occurred perfectly interspersed amidst vague and unsubstantiated rustic accounts, classifying all the unfortunate occurrences as lamentable attacks orchestrated by hungry animals of large and disproportionate size. Countless herds of valuable farm animals mercilessly decimated in the dead of night. Innocent, yet reckless, amateur tourists on isolated trails who magically got lost among the infinite abyssal crevices of the rocks and never returned alive to their original tourist posts. Strange nomads and unrelated wanderers who mistakenly crossed the silent roads at dawn and who ended up being cruelly erased from the records of existence. To systematize my grim reasoning, I meticulously elaborated a huge, improvised chronological table in my old, tattered investigative police notebook. I spent long, drawn-out hours exhaustively cross-referencing all the sparse exact dates of those bizarre, deadly incidents of blackouts and obscure disappearances directly with the monthly administrative sheet that recorded attendances and the routine activity report schedules of the operational officers of the government police station itself, as well as the attached supplementary reports from the City Hall on civil leave. It was precisely at the moment of that final statistical and analytical cross-referencing that I felt the continuous flow of my blood literally stagnate and suddenly freeze within my thick human veins and arteries. I discovered, to my shock, that for every single exact and specific date coinciding with a tragic account of a violent attack in the forest, or an obscure rural disappearance filed away with impunity throughout those long 10 years of hidden human bloodshed, there invariably and cowardly existed a small bureaucratic signed memo demanding immediate leave for obscure medical reasons, or a typed note requesting inexplicable and untimely extended isolation leave, signed for none other than the bizarre David Miller, always citing an exhausting need for quiet rest in the large, untouchable family cabin on the southern slopes of the upper mountains. The gigantic and impenetrable obscure son of the untouchable supreme sheriff of the city was always outside the limited social circulation radars of the city and far from the watchful eyes of normal inhabitants precisely during the exact macabre dates of the cruel and deadly bloody incidents that occurred without interruption. The circumstantial connection, previously considered merely indirect and fanciful by my fragile, disturbed mind, became, in that isolated room of forgotten files, a massive, irrefutable and nauseating confirmation of the densest and most rotten reality of the invisible world. The cruel, feared and all-powerful Sheriff Miller was not merely neglecting or covering up any logistical failures of the weak local and environmental security patrols. What this lawman had been actively covering up and financing with armed authority for uninterrupted years was the massacre freely perpetrated by the predatory instinct of his own cursed son. The indescribable and brutal anomaly of genetic fury, the true, living and irrevocable curse ingrained in the deformed bones, the insatiable carnivorous monster of rural legends from the dark forest, however science might dare to appropriately label that nameless mutant abomination. The terrifying conclusion could no longer be refuted. David and the relentless creature were exactly and irrefutably the same destructive and lethal entity. The inhuman and cold sheriff shamelessly and naturally used his civic rank and the feared, shielded, supreme authority of the isolated inland town exclusively for the nefarious purpose of aggressively cleaning up and methodically isolating all the horrific Dantean scenes of savage crime, uttering merciless veiled threats and directly blackmailing frightened potential eyewitnesses, as well as professionally forging false official reports at the police station. All these systematic and elaborate schemes and protections by the local police ensured only that the cursed, monstrous son could have free and unrestricted access to the defenseless herds and roam freely through the dark wastelands of the frigid dawns, thus satiating his obscure, monstrous thirst for violence through complete dismemberment with the most vile, sadistic and repulsive total impunity existing over the immaculate white blood-stained face of the Colorado land. The agonizing ethical and moral conflict began to tear and devour the pure and desperate entrails of my human soul from the inside out in the disturbing silence of that cursed little back room. I had formally sworn before the solemn institutional flags to protect the inalienable integrity of peaceful people, to apply without any class distinctions the firm rigidity of the protective law to sinners. But instead, I discovered in the worst possible way that the very thick and bureaucratic law, methodically crafted, was in fact the impenetrable and armored steel shield in favor of the greatest and most bloodthirsty predator of frightened humanity. I was bound, chained and doomed to deal completely alone with a voracious predator and violent serial killer of a mercilessly supernatural nature who paradoxically counted exclusively on the total and unrestricted, unpunished and veiled patronage of all the protective spheres of the oppressive state. I hastily closed the moldy and smelly criminal record folder with my 2 weak hands, trembling long and violently on the raw leather of the rat-eaten cover from the basements. The normal world in which I had always lived shattered completely right there in that deep pit of deadly secrets. I was inescapably entangled in a terrible bureaucratic and extremely bloody and fatal nightmare, from which no legal recourse to the basic rights of human existence could truly rescue me without costing me all the useless skin and tender, trembling muscles of my tense, shrunken living body. The terrible, overwhelming and painful conscious and palpable realization that the most aloof armed civic authority is systematically geared towards protecting without restraint the unchecked expansion of a grave, fatal collective danger was without the slightest shadow of a doubt, an immeasurable fear, far more profound, torturous, and destructive to the fragile sanity of a former believer than the base and primitive fear of bodily dismemberment, resulting solely from the tangible and lacerating physical damage of the sharp, lethal 10-inch claws of the hairy monster roaming hidden and deadly amidst the darkness of the long, damp, solitary woods of ancient pines. In that enclosed and silent space beneath the dusty floorboards, the profound, unwavering conviction that weighed heavily and anchored sharp, thick bolts to my already shattered, solitary sanity was absurdly horrifying, terrifying, and unthinkable. I would never have any viable, dignified, and effective chance of survival if I tried to report all this deranged madness to the blind instances of methodical human justice, or even to trust in salvation from the ignorant and incredulous naivety of any other poor and foolish person in danger, for I also lacked the slightest glimmer of logical security to make any disastrous and ill-considered desperate tactical call to the high-ranking bureaucrats in suits who rest in protected and secure, glass-walled offices hundreds of endless miles away from that impending chaos. The cunning, cruel, and heartless, unscrupulous Sheriff Miller would certainly have the entire false and meticulously constructed public narrative very well controlled and aligned to the level of morbid and standardized repetition among the entire contingent of cornered, complicit, and fearful citizens who prefer the fearful closing of their meager and naive eyes in the face of explicit evil. Any and all compelling evidence of what was lurking would be cynically erased from the bureaucratic annals, and the overwhelming domination of silence would prevail. The thick and suffocating oppressive cloud of the deepest and most impenetrable solitary paranoia was finally erected, and in a complete state of untouchable perfection around my expressionless figure, isolated in the musty darkness of the abandoned dungeon of the corrupt police station. From that dark and cruel moment infused with unbridled dread, each ephemeral, irregular shadow cast on the grey ground could in fact be a lethal predatory deception perpetrated by the fearsome, anthropophagic, carnivorous, warm-blooded mutant predator that hunted solitary souls in the silent heat of the long night in lethal despair. Simultaneously, I was cruelly forced to acknowledge that each damned and naive call for help, insistently emanating from the precarious crackling wave device on my old tactical radio, fixed without reasonable or visible security to the frigid vest of my uniform, could cruelly and methodically be yet another new and brutal ambush, cunning and lethal, intentionally plotted by the merciless monsters of this damned, secluded village, with the sinister, abject and fatal primary and immediate purpose of transforming the weary carcass of my desolate, naive figure into the unfortunate, macabre, predatory main course of bloody dinner before swallowing me amidst despair and suppressed screams in the icy, lethal dawn in the endless, damp forests of the great, cursed wild cemetery. The snowstorm that swept through the Pine Ridge region that same Friday night was described by state meteorologists as a weather event of catastrophic proportions, with temperatures plummeting violently to a lethal 20 degrees below zero Fahrenheit in a matter of mere hours. I was locked in the patrol car, heater on full blast, patrolling the desolate and forgotten state highway, a strip of precarious asphalt that cut through the deep valley about 18 miles from the thermal safety of the central police station. The dashboard radio emitted constant static noise due to the dense atmospheric interference, but around 2 o'clock in the morning, a fragmented and desperate transmission broke through the hiss. It was the choked and panicked voice of a young woman reporting that her car's engine had suddenly died near the old loggers' turnoff and that something gigantic was circling the vehicle in complete darkness. I immediately recognized the geographical location. It was an isolated stretch, surrounded by rock walls nearly 100 feet high, where cell phone signal was non-existent and visibility was no more than 10 yards in the blizzard. Before I could sound the siren and step on the gas, Sheriff Miller's icy, authoritative voice invaded the police radio frequency, expressly ordering all units to maintain their urban patrol routes, cynically claiming that the call was just a recurring prank call from teenagers in the neighboring town, and that the loggers' detour was impassable and too dangerous to risk county equipment. The instruction was clear, direct, and laden with a veiled threat that made my stomach churn. He was actively isolating the victim. He knew perfectly well that his son was hunting in that isolated area that very night, and was using the law's emblem to ensure that the monster had its time and its feast without any interruption or official witness. The moral conflict that had been gnawing at me for days exploded inside my chest with the force of a visceral punch. I abruptly switched off the radio communicator, eliminating any possibility of voice tracking, engaged the four-wheel drive of the heavy vehicle, and violently turned the steering wheel toward the forbidden detour, completely ignoring superior orders, and signing, at that very second, my own death warrant in the corrupt court of Pine Ridge. The journey through the slippery ice and biting winds was absolute psychological torture, with the vehicle skidding at every treacherous curve, while my mind projected the most grotesque scenarios imaginable of what I would find at the end of those long 7 miles of unpaved road, knowing that with every minute lost, the young woman trapped in the middle of nowhere was being watched, tested, and psychologically tortured by a predator who knew no meaning of mercy. When the halogen headlights of my patrol car finally pierced the white curtain of ice at the end of the detour, they illuminated the rear of a compact sedan, half buried in the deep snow. The vehicle was completely dark, inert, its windows covered in a thick layer of frost. I leaped out, my service rifle gripped tightly, sinking my heavy tactical boots into nearly 2 feet of fresh snow. The absolute cold hit my face like dozens of invisible blades, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins negated any thermal discomfort. I approached the driver's side door, my heart pounding in my ribs, only to find the window shattered from the outside in and the car's interior tragically empty. However, there wasn't the absurd amount of blood I expected to see. There was only a single, solitary woman's purse lying on the floor, and a chaotic trail of desperate human footsteps fleeing the car towards a thick curtain of ancient pine trees. About 500 feet away, nestled at the base of a rocky slope, stood an old, abandoned wooden hunting cabin, a decrepit shelter used by deer hunters decades ago. Without a second thought, I lit the tactical flashlight mounted on my gun barrel and began frantically following the trail before the wind swept away the girl's tracks forever. Reaching the cabin's decaying porch, I found the heavy, solid oak door ajar, held only by a rusty makeshift latch on the inside. I forced my way in with my shoulders and was met by oppressive darkness and the smell of old mold mixed with the cold sweat of pure terror. Huddled in the farthest corner of the single room, under an overturned lumberjack's table, was a girl no more than 20 years old, trembling so violently that her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Her eyes were bulging, dilated with the madness of panic, and she pressed her knees to her chest in a futile, defensive, fetal position. Keeping my voice as low and soft as possible so as not to cause a heart attack in the victim, I identified myself as a police officer and informed her that we were leaving immediately. She simply shook her head violently, desperately gripping the sleeve of my thermal jacket with fingers that felt like human claws. In whispers punctuated by dry sobs, she reported that she couldn't return to the car because the giant man wouldn't let her go. She said the dark-furred giant was just toying with her, running in circles around the vehicle on two legs and banging on the metal roof with hands as heavy as sledgehammers to keep her awake and terrified. The confirmation of the creature's sadistic modus operandi hit me hard. He didn't just want to kill quickly. He, David, the son of the man who dictated the law in that city, found a morbid pleasure in the psychological torture of his victims. A trait of pure human evil mixed with the instinct of a monstrous alpha predator. Desperation heightened my spatial awareness. The radio in my vest was silent. We were miles from any civilization, inside a rotting wooden matchbox in a relentless storm, and the greatest killer in those mountains knew exactly where we were hiding. The false sense of security afforded by the cabin's thin walls evaporated in less than 10 minutes of agonizing silence. I had positioned the girl in the structural blind spot, far from the only window covered by loose boards, and kept my rifle's sights locked towards the entrance door. That's when the atmosphere changed. The interior temperature seemed to drop even further, and that unmistakable, putrid and overwhelming smell of an open-air slaughterhouse and wet animal relentlessly seeped through the cracks in the raw wooden floor. The air became thick, almost impossible to breathe. The first physical contact wasn't visual, it was structural. The entire structure of the old hunting cabin trembled from its stone foundations when a massive weight, easily estimated at around 600 pounds of dense mass, landed brutally on the worn roof, directly above our heads. The old wood creaked in agony, bending downwards under the weight of that walking abomination. I could perfectly follow, through the vibration transmitted by the ceiling beams, the slow, bipedal heavy steps, walking methodically from one end of the roof to the other. The creature was studying the terrain, smelling our anguish through the deteriorated thermal insulation, imposing a territorial dominance that obliterated any remaining vestige of human courage I might have had. The girl let out a muffled groan, pressing her hands against her face to prevent her desperate crying from further drawing the attention of the horror above us. I swallowed hard, feeling the cold sweat trickle down my spine beneath my thick, tactical uniform. There was no negotiation, no weight of authority from the gleaming metal badge on my chest that could stop this. The law of men was worthless against a carnivorous mutation with 10 inches of curved claws. The monstrous being stopped exactly in the center of the roof, and the continuous pressure applied to the boards indicated that it had crouched, positioning its weight to tear the structure apart. The feeling of being trapped in a deadly trap, fighting against an immeasurable and unbeatable force that the very sworn police protected in absolute secrecy, caused a total collapse in my perception of justice and survival. My breath became short and painful. I unlocked the weapon's safety with my slippery thumb, knowing deep down that the copper-jacketed bullets of a standard rifle would do little against the muscle and bone density I had analyzed in the damage done to the cars and the carcass of the large elk deep in the forest. We were about to become part of the sordid, inactive file of disappearances that Sheriff Miller would sign off on the following morning without the slightest hint of remorse or guilt. The initial attack didn't come from above, as the monster's macabre intelligence falsely led us to believe. It was a diversionary tactic. The ceiling continued to groan under its residual weight, while the real assault took place at the oak main door. The force of the external impact was so brutal and immense that the entire door, with its thick cast-iron hinges and supporting wooden frame, was ripped from the wall structure and hurled with extreme violence into the center of the cabin, shattering the table where the girl had been hiding minutes before. Through the enormous disfigured opening in the wall, the snowstorm surged into the room in a gust of white terror, but what stood in the destroyed frame blocked almost all the light coming from outside. It was immense. Descriptions in rural legends don't prepare the human mind for the reality of standing before a fully grown male werewolf, thirsting for fresh blood. The figure stood over 7 feet tall, a mountain of contracted muscles covered in thick grayish fur that resembled barbed wire soiled with dirt and dark sap. Its shoulders were broad enough to fill the double entrance, and its arms ended in elongated hands with claws darkened by layers of old human and animal carnage. But what confirmed my ultimate condemnation was the creature's face, briefly revealed by the tremendous beam of my flashlight. The elongated snout was animalistic and repulsive, with jagged, crimson-stained teeth displayed in an expression of sadistic fury, but the eyes that reflected the light were profoundly dark, apathetic, and possessed the exact same expressionless psychopathic intelligence I had faced hundreds of times inside the Pine Ridge police station. It was David. The genetic monstrosity overflowed with calculated human malice. Before it could take its first merciless step into the room and slice us apart, I raised my rifle and fired 3 consecutive shots, aiming at the center of that immense, furry ribcage. The gunshot in the enclosed space was deafening, the smell of burnt gunpowder filling the air in a suffocating way. The projectiles hit their target, tearing through the air and penetrating the monstrous flesh, but the physical effect was minuscule. The impact of the high-velocity bullets only made the creature recoil half a step, shaking its massive shoulders as if it had been struck by insignificant stones. However, the surprise of the armed attack and the bright flash of the shots in the dark caused a fraction of a second of visual disorientation in the predator. It was the only miserable opening we would have in our entire lives. I didn't wait to see its recovery. I grabbed the shocked girl's jacket with my free hand and pulled her with extreme desperate force toward the back window, which was blocked by rotten boards. I threw the full weight of my uniform and equipment against the rotten wood, shattering the barrier and plummeting out into the freezing snow abyss of the night. Falling into a steep ravine of hard earth, while the beast roared its deafening frustration inside the ruined cabin we had just abandoned. The fall down the steep ravine behind the destroyed cabin lasted only a few agonizing seconds, dragging my body and the young woman's overexposed thick roots and sharp rocks hidden beneath the deep layer of snow. We tumbled at least 30 feet downhill until we violently struck the massive trunk of a fallen pine tree, whose wingspan offered a tiny, precarious shelter like a frozen trench in the earth. The impact cut off my breath and sent a wave of sharp pain through my left shoulder, but the urgency of escape overcame any physical and biological trauma. The girl was sobbing uncontrollably, completely disoriented and unable to stand, which meant that a frantic run through the open woods back to my vehicle would be completely out of the question and would result in a fatal chase. I pushed her aggressively, but with the necessary urgency for survival, into the hollow space formed by the thick, twisted roots of the fallen tree, dragging my own body afterward into the filthy hole of frozen mud, covering our exposed heads with as much loose snow and dry foliage as I could gather in the dark. Minutes dragged on like endless hours. The penetrating and relentless cold of 20 degrees below zero began to numb my extremities in an initial process of severe hypothermia. But the true terror overcame the imminent cold. Up there, at the top of the elevation, the gigantic and bestial silhouette descended heavily from the cabin. The creature began to walk methodically along the edges of the ravine. Its immense hot breath formed volcanic clouds of steam that descended towards us. It was sniffing the turbulent air, searching for the metallic scent of our terror through the dense blizzard that masked our body tracks. I held my human breath until my lungs burned like embers, pressing the girl against my chest to stifle her uncontrolled sobs, while clutching the unloaded rifle like a useless piece of metal. The predator passed within a mere 2 yards of our vulnerable hiding place in the ground. The stench of death, decay, and foul fur emanating from it was so overwhelmingly nauseating at that close range that I nearly choked on my own churning stomach. The monstrosity stopped abruptly right in front of our rotting wooden refuge and remained motionless for countless agonizing minutes, its misshapen snout turning from side to side. I could see the details of the biped's bloody claws and absurd leg muscles sinking into the white ground right there in front of me, aware that a single unfortunate movement of a leaf would condemn us to complete and instantaneous dismemberment. The psychological cruelty of that weight, the fact of being hidden underground like a wretched worm, terrified by the son of the highest civic authority in my county, who treated us as mere food in his own free territory, was the final ruin of my entire conception of security in the human world. All that remained was to pray fervently that the wind wouldn't change its course, or that the false lights of dawn would scare the monster away, before my heart stopped from the cold or from the fangs of that real and palpable abomination. Eternity has a weight and a temperature, and on that cursed night in the isolated Colorado mountains, it weighed tons and registered a merciless 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Time ceased to exist beneath those rotting pine roots, transforming into a torturous and suffocating cycle of pure physical terror and impending mental delirium. The massive, shapeless monstrosity, the true genetic and carnivorous anomaly that Sheriff Miller secretly protected and nurtured with the blood of his own town, stood less than 5 feet from our tiny, wretched hole in the frozen mud for a period that seemed to tear at the very fabric of my already shattered sanity. I could feel the heavy, earthy vibration of each heartbeat of that nameless beast reverberating brutally through the hard ground. A slow, powerful, animalistic cadence that attested to its insurmountable, supernatural vitality. The unbearable, putrid odor of dirty fur, musky sweat, and old blood oozing from its pores continued to invade my nostrils, causing violent nausea that I had to forcefully swallow to avoid making even the slightest human sound. The snowstorm, which had initially been our worst and most fearsome climatic obstacle, ended up revealing itself as our only miraculous and chaotic providential salvation during the darkest hours of the chase. The cutting winds and extremely thick blizzards that swept across the rocky slope began to swirl in uncontrolled whirlwinds, raising white curtains of pulverized ice that completely obliterated our olfactory and thermal signatures in the surrounding environment. The titanic alpha predator, frustrated by the sudden sensory deprivation imposed by the cruel violence of nature itself, released a gust of hot, humid air that almost thawed the surface of my exposed face, and then, with heavy, resigned movements, began to slowly retreat. Each massive step of that muscular leg sinking into the snow generated a dull thud that grew increasingly distant, echoing through the deep forest until it was completely swallowed by the terrifying roar of the constant wind. However, the immediate relief of not being brutally disemboweled by immense claws gave way to a new and equally fatal lethal biological threat: severe and irreversible hypothermia. The absolute cold began to necrotize the extremities of my injured body. I could no longer feel my own toes inside the heavy, lined tactical boots, and my hands were completely paralyzed, stiff and claw-like around the useless, unloaded rifle that I still stupidly and stubbornly held. The young girl beside me had entered a dangerous and silent state of extreme lethargy. Her spasms of crying had completely ceased, and her shallow, rarefied breathing indicated that her vital organs were beginning to methodically shut down one by one to preserve the little remaining internal heat in her core. I lay awake, forced to myself, digging my numb nails into the palms of my own hands, focusing my blurry vision on the absolute darkness and fighting against the treacherous and seductive drowsiness of the deep freeze, until, after many endless hours of agony, the first faint rays of a sickly grey light began to timidly seep through the dense canopy of the great dead trees, announcing the end of the longest and most terrifying night of my entire human existence. The pale morning light revealed the catastrophic scene of our precarious survival, illuminating the vast, merciless white expanse of a forest that had peacefully witnessed our near-total extermination. The simple, mundane, biological act of trying to get up from the frozen ground demanded an absurd amount of immense willpower and caused excruciating joint pain that threatened to instantly erase my consciousness. My knees cracked violently, and my left shoulder, dislocated during the terrible fall down the steep ravine, throbbed with sharp pains of pure agony with every small rotational movement. The girl was completely incapacitated, an inert human burden, unable to even articulate a coherent word or move her legs, paralyzed by the extreme cold of the early morning. With absolutely no other viable tactical option or means of communication, I pulled the semi-conscious young woman up and roughly carried her on my own back with the only functional arm I had left, beginning a desperate, slow and suicidal march through the mountainous terrain, covered by more than 2 feet of fresh, treacherous snow. We had to climb back up the embankment with immeasurable difficulty, passing well past the completely shattered remains of the hunting cabin to avoid looking at the indescribable evidence of the colossal destruction caused by the monster's impossible physical strength. Reaching the unpaved detour where the original truck had been wrecked was only the first step in an inhuman ordeal. We staggered for almost 3 miles of pure desolation and isolation, accompanied only by the sickening sound of the wind howling through the rock walls and the monotonous, irritating creaking of my own boots dragging through the dense snow, always with the paranoid and oppressive feeling that we were being silently watched with every faltering step by the immense dark trees that lined the path. The ingrained psychological fear that the carnivorous anthropomorphic aberration might decide to return to the daylight to finish its macabre sporting work kept the adrenaline pumping toxically through my weakened veins. Fortunately for our miserable luck, the predator preferred the comfort of its untouchable cabin and the black cloak of absolute darkness. After almost 2 uninterrupted hours of forced and excruciating marching, exhausted, dehydrated, and bordering on structural collapse of body and mind, we finally reached the edge of the main state highway, a grey strip almost forgotten by human progress. Our salvation did not come from any kind of official security or rescue authority sent by the unscrupulous Pine Ridge Department, but rather through a mere providential coincidence. A lone driver of a state government snowplow truck, completely oblivious to the microcosm of horror and local corruption of that cursed town, who braked sharply on his heavy yellow machine upon glimpsing in the distance the ragged figure of an armed police officer bleeding profusely and carrying an inert female. Victim in the middle of the isolated morning snowstorm, the enormous truck rushed us out of the nefarious confines of the cursed county directly to the clean doors of a safe regional hospital in a vastly larger neighboring town, completely outside Sheriff Miller's direct sphere of influence. The thermal relief of the white stretchers, the needles injecting warmed saline into my veins, and the clinical frenzy of doctors and nurses rushing through the sterile corridors felt like an almost unbearable shock of reality for someone who had just returned from the abysses of primal hell. The girl was immediately sedated, intubated, and preventively treated for amputation of fingers, necrotic from prolonged frostbite, plunging into a psychiatric state of acute catatonia induced by severe post-traumatic stress, from which doctors said she would likely never fully recover. I, on the other hand, received strong intravenous painkillers for the excruciating pain in my dislocated shoulder and remained awake and in a state of mute shock in a private ward bed. But the gigantic and impenetrable invisible machine of institutional corruption, the true culprit behind the horror, never rests and has absurdly long arms. It took no more than 4 scant hours for the imposing and heavy doors of my hospital room to be opened without warning. Sheriff Miller entered the small hospital room with his usual upright posture, wearing his perfectly pressed uniform, his wide-brimmed hat in his hands, and a facial expression sculpted in absolute coldness and pure sociopathic cynicism. Exuding that authority that annihilates any hope, he was not accompanied by any doctor or nurse. He had isolated the area with his rank. Miller walked slowly to the foot of my metal hospital bed, calmly analyzed my deplorable physical state, weakened by injuries and administered drugs, and then pronounced his final verdict in the soft, dragging and menacing tone of a human predator, far worse than any bestial animal. He stated categorically that Pine Ridge City rescue officials had found my wrecked vehicle off course, and that official department records would indicate, for purely legal and public purposes, that I had heroically rescued a disoriented civilian after a regrettable and common panic attack triggered by an unfortunate encounter with a pack of sick wild dogs in the blind snowstorm. He made it abundantly clear in the subtext of his macabre speech that any small, stupid and persistent deviation on my part from this convenient and irrefutable official narrative would culminate not only in my summary dismissal and legal incapacitation in the state for schizophrenic insanity or induced delirium, but would also result, accidentally and tragically, in mysterious and lethal violent disappearances involving all the few people I loved most back in my hometown of Denver. The system wasn't broken in those mountains. It had been meticulously rebuilt over dark decades to serve and conceal the worst abomination in nature. In that tiny hospital room, subjugated by institutional threats and exhausted to the last bearable limit of my fragile soul, I methodically signed, with trembling hands, the completely false and incomplete preliminary report, colluding against my own moral will in the disgusting cover-up of encounters with werewolves that blind humanity vehemently refuses to accept as real, and allowing the immense and bloodthirsty monster of fur and fury and its powerful suited father to remain absolutely untouchable, reigning sovereignly over their vast city of silent and frightened prey. My career in state law enforcement ended abruptly, crushed and discarded on that same bitter, hazy day within that white hospital bed. I silently handed over my gleaming silver badge, my useless rifle, and the keys to my patrol car to the superior officers of the neighboring county with the banal and unassailable excuse of debilitating post-traumatic stress disorder following the harshness of the deadly blizzard. The stark truth is that I could never again physically wear a sworn police uniform without feeling the uncontrollable urge to vomit and the repulsive taste of blood in my throat, knowing that the very structural foundations that should protect fragile humanity can cowardly act to conceal those who mercilessly devour it in the shadows of the silent dawn. I left the vast, mountainous state of Colorado without glancing back even once in my car's rearview mirrors, crossing the extensive and monotonous Central American plains and fleeing over 2,500 miles, geographically and culturally distant from those cursed, bloody, rocky heights, seeking refuge in a small, populous and chaotic coastal town, where the endless, oppressive, scorching asphalt, the constant visual pollution, and the neurotic, suffocating agglomeration of millions of alienated humans offer me some microscopic and illusory kind of mental comfort against the horrors of the uninhabited and icy woods. But the true and devastating bitter survival lies precisely in the biological and cerebral impossibility of forgetting the relentless cruelty of what I saw and smelled. The irreversible emotional consequences and profound rupture with the so-called normal world, which have parasitically taken root in my brain, have completely destroyed my previous naive capacity to blindly trust in the justice of ordinary men and the goodness of the prevailing governmental system. I have become a reclusive 28-year-old hermit with the mind of an 80-year-old, living in utter misery behind doors locked with triple, thick steel locks, sleeping and waking under the blinding light of my room to avoid facing the darkness, and keeping a heavy, deadly loaded weapon under my sweaty pillow during each night of constant vigil. The absolute loss of trust in this fragile world is an open wound that festers with each new suspicious glance or each mysterious report on the news. A latent paranoia assails me whenever I hear the routine news about bizarre and inexplicable cases of people who suddenly vanish without leaving absolutely any concrete trace in the dense forests of national parks, or the curious reports filed away in the back drawers of police bureaucracy that stubbornly and generically blame the dreaded grizzly bears and supposed stray packs of sick dogs. I know intimately what is happening out there. I know the true and grotesque, monstrous and gigantic shape and the exact proportions of those footprints embedded in the hardened ground. I know the terrifying predatory anatomy of that nameless predator disguised as an obedient offspring, and the unshakable and desolate certainty that the town of Pine Ridge will forever continue to actively feed and nurture its own incarnate scourge with impunity is an unbearable burden of cursed knowledge. I escaped certain death in a purely physical and bureaucratic way. However, my peaceful human essence and my illusory and childish hope were completely shattered, torn in two, and eternally devoured and consumed in that dark and remote cursed forest of oblivion. Therefore, this is not just a simple mystery story to scare young people at a camp, and I have firmly decided to share these exhaustive, traumatic, and undeniable memories publicly, because the extreme and unpunished danger that dwells among the immense crevices of forgotten mountains is something real, palpable, and incredibly lethal. Those of you who love to seek a tranquil, natural refuge from the big city on the high back roads, in bucolic cabins, or who wholeheartedly appreciate the activities of camping alone and isolated from civilization in distant places, you have no idea of the fragility of the very flesh that covers your fragile bones, or the total insignificance of our arrogant, human, and civilized race when placed face to face in the pure darkness of night with the authentic and untamed alpha and monstrous, and predators that crawl hidden and protected under the hidden gears of human and corrupt law itself. Never, under any circumstances, be deceived by frightening stories and legends that romanticize or fantasize about the old and repulsive supernatural curses of legendary beasts or tales of distant packs. The real accounts, those classified in the darkest recesses of the locked shelves of the invisible police station, cruelly and graphically attest to the overwhelming smell of damp decomposition and blood, and the crushing sound of victims' cartilage mercilessly tearing apart on the floor of an isolated icy cabin in the dead of a storm. The palpable and definitive terror and unconditional dread is what happens to the fragile mind of a normal, honorable man when you painfully discover that the enormous hairy beast that devours people during the long, merciless night possesses a common human name, an authentic bureaucratic registration certificate, and worst of all, the aggravating factors of the corrupted natural world, has the extreme armored protection of the sheriff and the entire cruel and fearful silent system of a city. Completely sickened by the veiled evil of the continent's own insurmountable mountains. If you think that genuine horror stories and encounters with werewolves are pure and childish inventions to generate momentary entertainment, or to occupy the sleepless hours of the deep night of the contemporary internet, I humbly and desperately ask that you never blindly trust the false and perfect guarantees of civil normality provided by the strangers in the unknown cities where you decide to spend the night. This brutal and exhausting, terrifying outburst from Mark about his complete psychological destruction through supernatural impunity comes to an end, leaving behind this dense, suffocating and bitter feeling of the emptiness of survival and a perpetual warning about the nefarious and frightening power of corruption combined with the worst abysses of the invisible world. If this true and terrifying account brutally accelerated your fragile heartbeat and caused you dark shivers of true terror in the silence of your empty room, don't let this insane account disappear into the depths of the algorithmic oblivion of the app. Intensely enjoy our video today. Leave a powerful comment right below telling me what was the worst and most disturbing psychological and physical feeling you had during this agonizing escape through the frozen Pine Ridge Mountain. Subscribe urgently and without fail to the Werewolf Howling of the Midnight channel. And don't forget to activate notifications so you don't miss any of our exclusive stories of pure fear. Share this terrifying video without hesitation with that best friend of yours who still insists on doubting the macabre. Until our next encounter with the inexplicable, remain constantly alert and never trust the voices of the dark. The eternal hunt never ends.